Welcome to this lecture. Now we want to see ggplot function in action. We're going to start by attaching the package ggplot2. Okay, so now remember that we want to demonstrate the theory that we've been looking into. How can we write code using ggplot? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use this data set. Okay, so we're going to use this data set, right? So this is the data set. It's a built-in R data set that we're going to use for demonstration purposes. Okay, so the first step is to first create a ggplot object. Okay, so we're going to create a ggplot object, and then we want to say geom_point because we want to plot the points. Remember, we have to pass in the data, right? So it's the data that we're going to use. It empty cars data set, and then this function now where we specify the aesthetics. Okay, so in this case we want in the x-axis to have the weight, and in the y-axis we want to have miles per gallon. Okay, so if we run this here is the resulting graphic. So as you can see, this here by default, because we specified the points, it's going to give us the scatter plot. So as you observe, on the x-axis we have weight, and on the y-axis we have the we have miles per gallon. So what we have done in this example, we have mapped this variable, which is weight and miles per gallon, right, to the aesthetics x and y. So that is what we have done here to specify the position in the x-axis and in the y-axis. Okay, now let us look at the structure of this data frame, empty cars, right? So if we come here and we look at the nature, or can say this column here, we can see that this is a numeric column. So we first have to convert this into a factor. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Let's say we come here and say, let us create a graphic and say geom_point, right? And let us specify the data set and say empty cars, right? And then remember, we have to specify the position. Say in the x-axis we want the weight, and in the y-axis we want miles per gallon, right? So if you come in here and say shape, remember that what we want to do is we want to plot each point, right? And now it's going to depend on the value of cylinder, right? So if we come in here and say we pass in cylinder, and you try to run this, and you try to run this, now what you're observing is that R is giving us an error. So it's telling us that a continuous variable cannot be mapped to shape. That is because the nature of this column is numeric, so it's continuous. So what we need to do first is we need to first convert into a factor, right? We have to convert this column of cylinder into a factor in order for this variable to be mapped to shape. So what do I mean by that? Let us look here. If we come here and say we want to convert this to a factor, okay, we want to convert this into a factor. Let's check our parentheses. So if you come in here and say check our parentheses, right? So if we try to run this, so if you come here now, look at your plot, you can see now that in your plot the plotting points now use different plotting character, but that plotting character depends on this factor. Okay, you should be careful. You first have to convert this into a factor, right? As you can see, for each number of cylinders we will have a different plotting character, and that plotting character will depend on which value it is based on this cylinder, or based on the number of cylinder. So you should be careful with that. There is also another way in which you can do that. You can simply say, I want to go to this empty cars data frame and say, I want to convert this variable and say as dot factor, right? And you pass in cylinder, right? So, oh, excuse me, should have said empty cars. Then I say cylinder, right? And then if you come here and now you want to plot each plotting character based on a value of the number of cylinder. So in this case, you do not even need to specify factor, right? Because we have already converted this column into a factor using as.factor function. So let's run this. So if you run this, you observe now that it's specifying that this is cylinder and it has changed the way it has labeled this legend. It's now not factor cylinder, but it's now reading it as cylinder. That is because we have went into the original data frame and we have converted the column from numeric into being a factor, right? So you can see that if you try to say empty cars and you run this and you go to cylinder, you observe now that it is now not numeric, but it is factor with 3 factor levels, which is 4, 6, and 8. As you observe here that we have plotted each of these points in this scatter plot based on this column, right? So you should be careful with that. Remember that we can also change, right? We can also come to the scatter plot, and now let's say we can also change the size of the point. We can also change the shape of those points, right? So what do I mean by that? Let's say we come here and say ggplot. We're first gonna use an empty object, and we come and say geom_point, right? And we say data, we pass in empty cars, right? Now let us define our aesthetics and say on the x-axis we want weight, and the y-axis we want miles per gallon, right? Now what we want to do is we want to change the shape, right? So we come here and say shape. For example, we want triangles. Remember that you have to specify this outside of aesthetic function. That is because they are not depending on any value in the data set. Okay, and we also come here, we say size equals 3. Notice how we are specifying size and we're also specifying shape in this case. Remember that when we were using built-in R, in most cases we have to specify CX, right? That is character expansion, right? And in other case we have to specify PCH argument. But in this case, we are simply just saying shape and size, right? So let's run this. So if you observe here, we have changed the shape on this scatter plots into triangles of size 3. Okay, so that is how you can create a scatter plots and try to change the plotting character as well as the size, right? But in most cases, we want to save ourselves some typing. So if you can observe here, as I did have mentioned, is that we have been creating a graphic using an empty ggplot object, right? We can also define the data and aesthetics and any subsequent geometric layers within ggplot call. So what do I mean by that? So now we come here and say ggplot, right? We come and say specify the data and say empty cars, right? So we can also specify the aesthetics, say we want weight, and then we want the miles per gallon, right? Now we are specifying this inside this function, right? So if we try to run this, what you're observing now is that we simply just have created this graphic, but there is nothing, there are no layers, right? That is because, remember, we have not specified or we have not added any layer, right? So in order to do that, we're going to come here and say, now what is it that you want to add? We want to add points. All right, so we're going to come here and say gom_point, right? And how do we want these points? So if you run this, we see that we have added the points. Now inside gom_point function, we can also change the shape as well as the size of these points. Now we are going to do that inside this function, okay, gom_point, right? So we can say shape, we want the triangles of this size. Okay, if you run this, we have did the exact same thing in a different way. But now if you notice, this is that it becomes even more convenient to write code in this way. However, it's a matter of which one is better for you, but this is the mostly used syntax, right? So you first have to specify ggplot function, then you pass in the data, then you define your aesthetics, right? We're also going to look into color as well as any other any additional aesthetics. But for now, I'm just demonstrating how can you use ggplot in the most simplest way, right? So if in this case, we also want to add a linear line, right? So we first come here and say we add gom_smooth, right? And then we come and specify the method to be, say, linear model, and then we say, let's say we want the color of this to be red, right? So in this case, we simply just add a linear line of best fit to miles per gallon against weight plot. So if you run this, if you come here, right, and you observe here that we have managed to add a linear line of best fit and its color is red, right? So here it's specifying that it's using this formula, right? So you observe here that we have that linear line of best fit. Now, what happens if we also want to plot symbol by cylinder variable? So how can we do that? So we also come here and say, here in place of shape, we specify cylinder, right? However, we have to specify also the name of the data frame, right? So this is how you can plot symbol by a cylinder variable, right? So you have to specify that it comes from this data frame, and then you specify the column, right? So if you run this, you observe here that it has changed the points. So later we also want to see how can we add the legend as well as how can we manipulate legend using ggplot function.